It's been a pretty emotionally charged week. Maybe emotionally challenging week at GCC. This time last week, celebrating God's faithfulness to us and kind of the happiness of our 6th birthday. But for those of us who are members, pretty quickly we were catapulted to the other end of the emotional spectrum as we've had to walk through a pretty heavy pastoral heartache. And the issue itself has been heavy, but sometimes the hardest bit is that extreme of emotion. And maybe as we gather together this morning, we've still got wounds that are raw, emotions that are confused. Maybe we're feeling hearts that are in some way hardening. And maybe we've just got doubts that are still rising. Here's why it's good that we're back in Chronicles today. In the midst of something that's been really hard, God in His kindness gives us a sight of the King that we have. In 2 Chronicles 8 and 9, the writer just paints a portrait of the greatness of King Solomon. Now, right in the mix of the episode, we're told about a time where the Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon, having heard of his fame. So if you have a look, chapter 9, verse 7, look at what this queen says. She's met Solomon, she's asked him questions, they've hung out. And in chapter 9, verse 7, she says, "How happy your people must be." She goes on, "How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom." Nobody's ever said that in GCC. "Praise be to the Lord your God, who's delighted in you and placed you on his throne as king to rule for the Lord your God. Because of the love of the Lord your God for Israel and his desire to uphold them forever, he's made you, Solomon, king over them to maintain justice and righteousness." Now you hear what she said. She is saying that the greatness of King Solomon is the happiness of his people. See that connection? They can be happy because he is great. But look again at verse 8, second half, and look what she says. "Because of the love of your God for Israel and his desire to uphold them forever, he has made you king over them to maintain justice and righteousness." Why has God given them Solomon as king? Because he loves them and because he desires to uphold them. He doesn't just want them to feel happy, he wants them to know that they are held. And so this portrait of the greatness of King Solomon that we're going to look at is for the happiness and the heldness of his people. Now, for the people who would have read Chronicles first time round, we've seen they're just back in Jerusalem and they're sat there with no king yet sat on the throne. Which means the point of this portrait is to show them this is the king that you need. But for us reading it now, the point for us is to say, this is the king that you have. The Lord Jesus himself says in Matthew 12, Luke 11, "Something greater than Solomon is here." Now that means if the greatness of Solomon was both the happiness and the heldness of his people, we have something even greater than that. As King Jesus' people, we have even greater reason for happiness, and we are held with an even greater heldness. And I think that's something we need to hear today. And so all I want to show you is 3 things about the greatness of King Solomon, his worship, his wisdom, and his wealth. And in that I want to show you the greater greatness of King Jesus. His worship, his wisdom, his wealth. In the game? Yeah? Okay, here's the first one. Chapter 8, verses 1 to 16. The greatness of a king who leads you to worship God. Zoom might be better than me. The greatness of a king who leads you to worship God. Now, if you have a look at chapter 8, verse 1, you can see that Solomon has just spent 20 years building the temple. This temple has been Solomon's priority, and it will be the kind of highest achievement in his 40-year reign as king. But now we get the details of what he builds next. So he built temple, then he builds his palace, and we're told now that he goes to kind of outlying cities and he builds places of protection and places of provision for his people. But in verse 12, having kind of detailed that, we're brought back from these outlying cities, and Solomon returns to the heartbeat of the temple again. Now, it's a big jump. He's going out and he's doing stuff like massive building projects, international relations with royalty, marriages to the queen of to Pharaoh's daughter. He's in all these places, building all these things with all these people. But all of a sudden, in verse 12, you go from massive, exciting things that are miles away to things that actually seem pretty mundane. Have a look at verse 12. All of a sudden, everything is brought back to the daily requirements of offerings, yearly festivals, and in verse 14, the daily requirements of sacrifices and praise to God. Now, what's the point? I think the point is, it is the temple that tethers him to the most important thing. Kind of like a retractable dog lead. Zip. It's like he puts a stake in the ground and he tethers his people at the temple going, doesn't matter what we do in these outlying cities, what matters is daily we're back here. It's as if he's saying relationships with kings are fine so long as you maintain the priority of the relationship with the King of Kings. It's as if he's saying creating homes for other people's good so long as you are spending time at home with God. Or storing up provisions for your people's future is okay, so long as you're seeking God's provision today. Or making sure that you're building fortified cities to protect your people from enemies is wise, so long as daily you're coming back to the place where God protects you from his wrath against sin. The temple might be finished, but you are not finished with the temple. You can make progress beyond these borders, but this must always be a priority. And the greatness of King Solomon is seen here in that he is leading his people to the worship of God every single day. Daily he leads them to the place of happiness. This is where we see the love of God that covers our sin. Daily he's leading them to the place of heldness. The presence of God here is what protects our lives. He tethers them to the temple. Do you get the point? You can do all these distant stuff, that's fine, so long as you're daily here. You can do all that rebuilding stuff, so long as you are regular here. Because without the worship of God, all that stuff is worthless. Isn't it? So he makes sure, verse 13, everything's done in the daily requirement for the offerings commanded by Moses. In verse 14, in keeping with the ordinance of his father David. It's nothing but holiness. Now, spoiler alert. This is not how King Solomon's reign actually ended. He's portrayed in Chronicles as being pretty much perfect. But if you read the book of Kings, you'll read that his life goes pretty pear-shaped. The tether comes loose, and his heart is seduced as he lusts after foreign women and he begins to worship their foreign gods. And as the king goes, so the people go. We're going to see that in the next 20 kings in Chronicles. A king sins, the people sin. A king falls, the people fall. And so, let me show you the greater greatness of King Jesus, whose love for you is undying and whose hold on you is unbreakable because his worship of God was unyielding. He will never lead you anywhere other than here. The worship of God. Now you see that in his life. How happy to have a king whose heart could not be seduced when Satan showed him all the splendor of the kingdom of this world. And he said, "Away from me, Satan. It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." You see it in how he lived. But actually we see it too in how he leads. How happy it is that when you are tempted into sin, Jesus leads you to pray, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from evil." You see, the way out of temptation is worship. How happy to have a king that when your religious habits have become a double-faced sham, to have Jesus lead you to see your Father in heaven who sees what is done in secret. See him. The way out of hypocrisy is worship. How happy to have a king that when you are drowning in a sea of anxiety, Jesus leads you to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. The way out of anxiety is worship. How happy to have a king that when you are seduced by a sense of your own self-importance, you have him lead you by saying, "Don't rejoice that demons submit to you, but rejoice that your name is written in heaven." The way out of pride is worship. How happy to have a king that when you have, out of fear of man, denied him 3 times, he leads you back to himself simply by asking, "Do you love me?" The way out of a fear of man and out of a relapse is worship. Do you see? In leading us to worship God, Jesus always and unfailingly leads us to a place of freedom and integrity and peace and joy and restoration. He will never lead you anywhere else. How happy to be led and held by this King. It means the place of safety for me and for you is following his lead every day in the worship of God. Please don't neglect daily worship. I don't care if you use this booklet or you use something else, but tether yourself every single day. Everything else in your life needs to be built upon this most important thing for your life. Everything in your future will depend upon this daily discipline. Everything else will be shipwrecked unless it is tethered to the worship of God. How happy to have a king who will lead you there every day. That's the first thing. Number 2. Chapter 8, 17 to 9, verse 8. Not just the greatness of a king who leads you in worship, but the greatness of a king who leads you in God's wisdom. So in the first one, we see a king for whom he leads you in nothing but holiness. In this one, you're seeing a king for whom nothing is too hard. And this is a scene in the episode where this Queen of Sheba comes on a state visit to hear Solomon to find out what all the fuss is about. So, chapter 9, verse 1, she talks about all that she had on her mind. In verse 2, he answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for him to explain to her. And in verse 3, having seen the wisdom of Solomon, she then goes on to admit, verses 5 and 6, we'll read this. The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I didn't believe it until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half the greatness of your wisdom was told me, for you have far exceeded the report I heard. And that's the moment where she goes, verse 7, how happy your people must be. Now again, you've got to notice the connection. She says, his wisdom is their welfare. So he says it's for maintaining justice and righteousness in verse 8. So when his people are facing injustice and unrighteousness, God's wisdom in Solomon is their welfare. Their need, met by his greatness. Now that's true for anybody. Our welfare is dependent upon the wisdom of those who lead us. Now you look at our politicians and you go, that explains a lot. Talk about justice. We are on our 10th Justice Secretary in 10 years, with the most recent one resigning over bullying allegations. But it's not just politicians. Our welfare is nurtured by the care of our parents. And for some of us, our lack of happiness and our lack of a feeling of heldness is because of the lack of the care of our parents. A big part of it is not just politicians and parents, but our peers lead us. And we need to acknowledge that there's a certain amount of unhappiness and unheldness that has come because pastors have lacked wisdom, and that has led to the lack of welfare of their people. You look at all these things and you go, you add in my own foolishness, and we go, where are we left? By those who have led us. And you are crying out going, we need something better. We need something greater, someone wiser. Because even though Solomon was capable of wisdom, he was catastrophically foolish. Just like you and me. That's why the greatest thing Solomon does for us is point us to the greater greatness of Jesus. And that's why the wisest thing Solomon did was connect wisdom with worship. If you've not read the Bible much before, this King Solomon wrote a book called Proverbs. It's all a book about wisdom. But on repeat, he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That means wisdom isn't just about knowing stuff. It's about worshipping God. Relating to Him rightly is the beginning of living rightly. And it's why I think that in the book of Proverbs, the picture given for wisdom isn't so much a book for you to read, but a God-like woman for you to know. It's relational. And actually the Lord Jesus is the one that woman wisdom in Proverbs is pointing us to. He is the wisdom of God that is worthy of your worship. We're going to read after the sermon from that moment where the kings or the wise men come and worship Jesus when he's just an infant. But see, when he was 12, he disappeared from his parents. They find him sat in the temple court, sitting amongst teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And it said of him, even at the age of 12, everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. And from then, his teaching and his parables and his knowledge of people's thoughts and his knowledge of their future and his ability to unpick and escape from people's traps shows him to be incomparably and unbelievably wise. If you've never read a gospel, read a gospel, you'll see he is the height of wisdom with not a hint of folly. But here's for me the greatest greatness about the greater wisdom of Jesus. His wisdom is for the welfare of fools. You see Jesus, and he's not hanging out with the Queen of Sheba. He's hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. And that's actually the thing that his enemies point at him and go, you are a glutton and a drunkard. And his reply to them at that moment is to say, wisdom is proved right by her deeds. He's coupling himself with woman wisdom. And he says it is a right thing for the wisdom of God in the Lord Jesus Christ to be for the welfare of fools. How happy it is that the wisdom of God would use the foolishness of the cross for my eternal welfare. How happy that God doesn't operate in accordance with the wisdom of this world, because if he did, he'd want nothing to do with us. But how happy that it is the wisdom of God to choose and to use people like you and me. How happy That one of the ways God upholds us is by putting his wisdom in us so that we don't have to be left to the consequences of our own foolishness. How happy that our lives are no longer at the peril of politician, parents, peers, or pastors, but that now they can be led by the inexhaustible wisdom of God. I love the little detail. Look at chapter 9, verse 12. The Queen of Sheba starts by peppering him with hard questions, but then she starts to pile on healthy gifts. She gives loads of stuff to him, but in verse 12 it's noted, he gave her more than she had brought him. How happy to have a king who always gives more than he gets. And my guess is there is some of us at the end of what has been a hard week who have been for the last 7 days asking ourselves loads of hard questions. Did I give good advice? Could I have done more? And here we're invited to stop asking ourselves questions and in some ways to come and test Jesus like Queen Sheba tested Solomon. And I assure you, this is what you will find. Nothing is too hard for him, and he will always give you more than you could ever give him. How happy. We need to keep going. Third thing. The greatness of a king who leads you with God's wealth. So we've gone from nothing but holiness, nothing too hard for him, and now we're seeing the situation where it just seems to be nothing but gold. So, worship, wisdom, and now wealth. So have a look, there's gold everywhere. Chapter 8, verse 18, he's given 17 tons of gold as a gift. That's not too shabby. 9, verse 9, he's given another 4.5 tons of gold. In 9:13, they chuck in a detail, he's given about 25 tons of gold every year. It's not a bad salary. If you measure things by the weight of elephants, it's about 4 elephants worth of gold. We're told in 9:17, his throne is overlaid with gold, as well as being surrounded by 14 lions. And then in 9:20, all King Solomon's goblets were gold. Anybody got goblets? You should get yourself a goblet. They sound cool. And then the detail, all the household articles, even his nose trimmer, gold. Isn't it mad? Now look at 9:15. Chapter 9, verse 15. He makes 200 large shields of hammered gold and 300 small shields of hammered gold. Now, we've just said he's unbelievably wise. Gold shields are unbelievably stupid. Right? They're good in terms of being ceremonial, but you take that to battle and a shield or an arrow will pierce that bad boy in an instant. But again, it's a demonstration of the extensiveness of his wealth. I am this wealthy, I can have shields that are just made for ceremony because it's how wealthy I am. If an enemy is considering to attack Israel, the question they've got to ask is, let's count the cost of war. Can our resources outgun and outlast theirs? And at this point, Solomon's gold shields are saying, I've got enough not just to protect my people, but to put off my enemies. The enemies sat in their little tents are going, I heard he's got 500 gold shields. Imagine what he's packing in conflict stuff, not just ceremonial stuff. Do you get the point? Scarce resources mean limited protection. Infinite resources mean infinite protection. His wisdom was his people's welfare. Now his prosperity is their protection. Now, if you've got your noggin even just slightly engaged, at this point you should be going, aha! This is the point that Solomon is greater than Jesus. Isn't it? What did Jesus have? Nothing. He was born in the poverty of a stable. In his life, he had nowhere to lay his head. At the end of his life, even the clothes from his back are stripped from him, and in his death, he has to borrow a tomb. If Solomon's prosperity was his people's protection, then surely Jesus' poverty is their vulnerability. No. Even here, we see the greater greatness of Jesus. He may have been homeless, but his forever home had been the riches of heaven. He may have been materially poor, but in no way was he impoverished. He might have had empty pockets, but within himself he had all the fullness of God. He may have looked like a pauper, but within himself he had the limitless power of God. So that he doesn't need the visitation of queens and kings to give him gold, but he has within himself the infinite wealth of the King of Kings. Which means, when his people need healing, he doesn't need to go and source a hospital, but he can heal them from the wealth of his health, just with a touch. And when his people are hungry, he doesn't need to go to Tesco with a credit card. He can just multiply a meal for thousands. And when his people are terrified of drowning in a storm, he can control creation just with a word. And when his boys are hiding behind a locked door in the days after he's been murdered, he can appear in their midst speaking protective peace, because the life he has from within himself have empowered a resurrection life beyond death. And you know what? Even in the moment where he looks most impoverished, even in the moment when he himself looks most vulnerable and unable to protect his people because his hands are literally tied, nailed to a cross, even there he is still protecting them. The wealth of his eternal nature, satisfying the whole of God's eternal wrath, so that he can share with his people the wealth of his eternal righteousness. How happy to have a king whose wealth is beyond the capacity of all of your enemies, and whose saving is beyond the totality of all your iniquities. How happy to have a king who, though he was rich, yet for your sakes became poor, so that we through his poverty might become rich. How happy to have a king whose infinite power means that we are so upheld that no one could snatch us out of his hand. And how happy to have a king who doesn't die like Solomon at the end of chapter 9 and leaves his throne vacant and his people vulnerable. But how happy to have a king whose life within himself empowers life beyond death, that means that his throne is never vacant and his people are never vulnerable. How happy you are held. This is your king. It's class, isn't it? And if you're not a believer here today, maybe some of your unhappiness and feeling of unheldness is because you've been worshipping things that are unworthy. You've been led by people who are unwise, and you're protected by something that's been proved unable. The reason for this portrait in 2 Chronicles 8 and 9 is for you to see the greatness of King Jesus and to see his blessings showered down upon us, that it might draw you to himself. And our prayer for you today, and our kind of plead with you today, is to come to this King and share in this happiness, and to share in the heldness of his wisdom and his wealth, and worship him, saying, "Worthy, worthy, worthy is this incomparable King."